Marcus Thompson wasn't like most 15-year-old teenagers in Chicago. While his peers spent their afternoons playing video games or hanging out at the mall, he could often be found in his small bedroom, surrounded by law books and court case documents. His mother, Sarah Thompson, worked as a paralegal at one of the city's busiest law firms, and perhaps that's where his fascination with law began. On this particular morning, Marcus sat at his desk, his fingers drumming against the worn wood as he memorized another set of legal precedents. The early autumn sunlight streamed through his window, illuminating the countless sticky notes covering his wall, each one containing a different legal term or important case reference. His photographic memory and extraordinary IQ of 165 made learning these complex legal concepts as easy as reading a comic book. Sarah watched her son from the doorway, a proud smile playing on her tired face. Working 2 jobs to support them wasn't easy, but seeing Marcus's dedication made every exhausting moment worthwhile. "Don't forget to eat breakfast, genius," she called out, adjusting her name badge. "There's oatmeal on the counter." Marcus nodded without looking up from his books. He had already memorized 3 new cases before 7 a.m., and his mind was buzzing with information about constitutional rights and judicial procedures. His teachers at Roosevelt High School had long since given up trying to challenge him in regular classes. Instead, they had arranged for him to take advanced online courses through local universities. The morning proceeded like any other until Marcus decided to walk to the public library after school. He needed to reference a specific law journal that wasn't available online. Taking his usual route down Madison Street, he passed by TechCub, one of those high-end electronics stores where everything seemed to cost more than 3 months of his mother's rent. As he walked past the store's gleaming windows, a commotion erupted inside. People were shouting, and security alarms blared. Marcus paused, his curiosity piqued by the chaos. That's when everything went wrong. A figure in a black hoodie burst out of the store, nearly knocking Marcus over. In the confusion that followed, store security rushed out, pointing at Marcus, who had stumbled backward, his backpack full of law books now sprawled on the sidewalk. "That's him. He's with the other guy," the security guard shouted, grabbing Marcus's arm roughly. "The one in the red backpack." Marcus's heart raced as he tried to explain. "Sir, there's been a mistake. I was just walking past." But his words fell on deaf ears. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, a man with steel-gray hair and an expensive suit, emerged from the store, his face red with anger. "I want him arrested. I saw him casing the store earlier." Despite Marcus's calm and rational attempts to explain the situation, the police were called. Officer Jenkins arrived within minutes, and although he seemed more willing to listen than the others, protocol demanded that he take the store owner's statement seriously. Sarah Thompson received the call while filing documents at work. Her hands shook as she listened to her son explain the situation from the police station. "Mom, don't worry," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "I know my rights, and this is clearly a case of mistaken identity." At the police station, Marcus sat straight-backed in the hard plastic chair, his mind already cataloging relevant cases and statutes that would help his situation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Detective Morris reviewed the incident report, occasionally glancing at the teenage boy who seemed far too composed for someone in custody. "You seem pretty calm for someone in trouble," Detective Morris observed, trying to gauge Marcus's reaction. "That's because I know that under the Fourth Amendment, and specifically according to Illinois v. Wardlow, presence in an area of expected criminal activity, standing alone, is not enough to support a reasonable suspicion that a person is committing a crime," Marcus replied without hesitation. The detective's eyebrows shot up, and he leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with new interest. This was no ordinary teenager. What he didn't know was that Marcus's case would soon land before Judge Howard Matheson, setting in motion a series of events that would challenge everyone's preconceptions and change lives forever. As Marcus waited for his mother to arrive with their neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, who worked as a public defender, he remained calm. He knew that truth and justice would prevail. They had to. What he didn't know was that his greatest test of knowledge, courage, and character was about to begin in Judge Matheson's courtroom. The following day, Marcus found himself sitting in a holding cell at the Juvenile Detention Center, waiting for his preliminary hearing. His mother had spent the night making phone calls, trying to gather evidence of his whereabouts before the incident. The stark white walls and cold metal bench did nothing to dampen his spirits. If anything, they strengthened his resolve. Detective Morris had been puzzled by the security footage from TechHub. The grainy video showed two figures, one clearly running from the store with stolen merchandise, and another, presumably Marcus, standing near the entrance. But something didn't add up. The timestamp on the footage showed inconsistencies, jumping forward several seconds at crucial moments. "I'm telling you," Mr. Peterson insisted, pointing at the screen in the security office. "He was casing my store. I saw him walking past several times that day." The store owner's face was still flushed with anger, his designer tie slightly askew as he gestured animatedly at the footage. Detective Morris rubbed his temples. "Mr. Peterson, the boy's school records show he's a straight-A student with no prior incidents. Are you absolutely certain about this?" "Those types can be the most deceptive," Peterson snapped, then immediately looked uncomfortable with his own words. Meanwhile, in the detention center, Marcus was writing detailed notes on a paper napkin, mapping out his defense strategy. His mother arrived with Mr. Rodriguez, their neighbor and public defender, carrying Marcus's spare clothes for the hearing. "Marcus, honey." Sarah's voice trembled slightly as she hugged her son through the cell bars. "Mr. Rodriguez has agreed to represent you." Mr. Rodriguez, a seasoned public defender with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, listened intently as Marcus laid out his thoughts on the case. The lawyer's eyes widened as the teenager cited case after case, outlining potential procedural issues with his arrest. "Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Rodriguez said quietly, "your son knows more about criminal procedure than some lawyers I know." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. in courtroom 302. As Marcus walked into the courthouse, flanked by his mother and Mr. Rodriguez, whispers followed them down the hallway. Several lawyers who knew Sarah from her paralegal work offered sympathetic nods. Judge Howard Matheson's courtroom was known for its strict decorum. The judge himself, a man in his 60s with thick glasses and a reputation for unconventional methods, surveyed the room as Marcus entered. Something about the teenager's composed demeanor caught his attention. "All rise," the bailiff called out as proceedings began. Mr. Peterson had brought his corporate lawyer, a sharp-suited woman named Ms. Richards, who presented the store's case with practiced efficiency. She displayed the security footage on the courtroom screen, pointing out what she claimed was evidence of Marcus's involvement. "Your Honor," Ms. Richards concluded, "the footage clearly shows the defendant acting as a lookout while his accomplice committed the theft." Marcus leaned over to whisper something to Mr. Rodriguez, who nodded, impressed. Standing up, the public defender addressed the court. "Your Honor, we move to suppress the security footage on grounds of authenticity. My client has noticed several technical inconsistencies in the video timestamps, suggesting possible tampering or malfunction." Judge Matheson peered over his glasses at Marcus, noticing how the boy seemed to be analyzing everything in the courtroom. The judge had seen thousands of juvenile defendants in his career, but something about this case felt different. "Young man," Judge Matheson addressed Marcus directly, breaking with usual protocol, "you seem to have something to say about this evidence." The courtroom fell silent. Even Ms. Richards turned to look at the teenage defendant with curiosity. Marcus stood, his voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, if I may, the security footage shows a time-stamped discontinuity of approximately 3.7 seconds at the crucial moment of the alleged crime. According to the Illinois Rules of Evidence, specifically Rule 901. Judge Matheson raised his eyebrows, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had seen enough juvenile cases to know when something extraordinary was unfolding before him. As Marcus continued his technical analysis of the evidence, the judge made a decision that would change the course of the proceedings. "Counsel, approach the bench," he called out, his mind already formulating an unusual plan to get to the truth of this case. Judge Matheson leaned back in his leather chair, studying the young defendant before him. The courtroom had grown unusually quiet, with even the usual shuffling of papers falling silent. After the brief sidebar with both attorneys, the judge had made an unprecedented decision. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Matheson's voice carried across the courtroom, "I'd like to try something different here." He removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly with a microfiber cloth. "We're going to play a little game I call Truth or Lie." Sarah Thompson shifted nervously in her seat, while Mr. Rodriguez looked concerned. This was far from standard procedure, but Judge Matheson was known for his unconventional methods when dealing with juvenile cases. Your Honor, Ms. Richards stood up. I must object to this unusual. Objection noted, Counselor. Judge Matheson cut her off firmly. But in my courtroom, I have some latitude in juvenile cases to pursue the truth through alternative means. Marcus stood at the defendant's table, his posture relaxed but alert. His mind was already racing through relevant cases about judicial discretion and juvenile court procedures. He had read about Judge Matheson's reputation for unorthodox methods in the local law journal. The rules are simple, the judge continued. I'll ask you questions, and you'll answer. But here's the twist. For each answer, you must cite a relevant legal precedent or statute that relates to your response. Any false statement or incorrect citation, and we end the game immediately. The courtroom gallery buzzed with whispers. Mr. Peterson, sitting in the front row, looked confused and somewhat annoyed. This wasn't the quick conviction he had been expecting. First question, Judge Matheson announced, folding his hands on the bench. Where were you at 3:15 p.m. on the day of the incident? Marcus cleared his throat. I was walking from Roosevelt High School to the public library, Your Honor. And according to Illinois v. Wardlow, 528 U.S. 119, 2000, mere presence in a high-crime area does not amount to reasonable suspicion for a stop. The judge's eyes twinkled with interest. Second question, have you ever been in TechHub before? Yes, Your Honor, twice. Once to price-check a laptop for my school research, and once with my mother, and as established in Terry v. Ohio, 392 U.S. 1, 1968. Previous visits to a location cannot be construed as evidence of criminal intent. Ms. Richards shifted uncomfortably in her chair. This wasn't going as planned. The juvenile defendant was turning her carefully prepared case into a constitutional law seminar. Very impressive, Judge Matheson nodded. Now, tell me about the moment the actual theft occurred. Marcus stood straighter. I was approximately 10 feet from the store entrance when the real perpetrator ran past me. Under Illinois state law, specifically 720 ILCS 5/5-2, mere presence at the scene of a crime does not constitute participation in that crime. The judge leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. And the security footage? Your Honor, the footage shows me stumbling backward when the actual thief ran past. According to the Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 901, and Illinois v. Thompson, electronic evidence must be authenticated properly, and any gaps or inconsistencies in digital timestamps can compromise its admissibility. Judge Matheson turned to the store owner. Mr. Peterson, are you aware of any technical issues with your security system? Mr. Peterson fidgeted with his tie. Well, we did have some maintenance work done last week. There might have been some glitches. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had started as a simple shoplifting case was transforming into something entirely different. The spectators watched in amazement as this 15-year-old boy matched wits with a judge known for his legal acumen. One final question, Judge Matheson said, a slight smile playing on his lips. Why law? Why such interest in legal precedents at your age? Marcus looked at his mother, then back at the judge. Your Honor, as Justice Thurgood Marshall once said, none of us got where we are solely by pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. We got here because somebody bent down and helped us pick up our boots. I study law because I believe in justice, and as stated in Gideon v. Wainwright, every person deserves a fair chance to prove their innocence. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Matheson sat back, removing his glasses once again. It was clear to everyone present that this was no ordinary case, and Marcus Thompson was no ordinary defendant. The game of truth or lie continued, but it had evolved into something more like a legal symposium. Judge Matheson found himself increasingly fascinated by Marcus's depth of knowledge. Each answer the boy gave wasn't just accurate, it was insightful, showing an understanding of law that went beyond mere memorization. Let's discuss the security footage in more detail, Judge Matheson said, gesturing for the court technician to replay the video. Tell me what you see, Mr. Thompson. Marcus stood confidently, his eyes fixed on the screen. Your Honor, if you look at the timestamp in the bottom right corner, there's a clear jump from 3:15, 42 to 3:15:46. During these missing seconds, the actual perpetrator enters the frame. According to the federal rules of evidence, specifically Rule 1003, a duplicate is admissible unless there are questions about its authenticity. Ms. Richards, the corporate lawyer, shuffled through her papers frantically. She hadn't expected to face such technical legal arguments from a teenager. Your Honor, the minor gaps in the footage don't invalidate. Let him finish. Judge Matheson interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. Marcus continued, furthermore, the camera angle changes slightly after the time jump, suggesting the camera may have been tampered with or moved during the maintenance Mr. Peterson mentioned earlier. The store owner shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His face had lost its earlier certainty, replaced by a growing look of concern. Your Honor, Marcus added, I'd also like to draw attention to the height difference between myself and the person in the black hoodie. Using the door frame as reference, the perpetrator appears to be at least 5 inches taller than me. Detective Morris, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery, stood up. Permission to approach, Your Honor. Judge Matheson nodded, intrigued by this unexpected development. We've been analyzing the footage at the precinct, Detective Morris explained. The boy is right. The suspect in the footage is significantly taller. We also found something else. He pulled out a tablet and showed it to the judge. The reflection in the store window shows the suspect has a distinctive tattoo on their neck. Mr. Thompson has no such marking. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Sarah Thompson squeezed her son's shoulder, tears of relief forming in her eyes. Judge Matheson raised his hand for silence. Mr. Thompson, you've demonstrated remarkable legal knowledge, but there's something I don't understand. Why didn't you mention these details about the height difference and tattoo immediately? Marcus's response was measured and mature. Your Honor, citing Tennessee v. Garner, I believed it was important to first establish the legal framework for examining evidence before presenting physical observations that could be disputed. Also, as stated in Brady v. Maryland, the prosecution has an obligation to disclose exculpatory evidence. I was confident that a proper investigation would reveal these discrepancies. The judge couldn't help but smile. You deliberately held back information to see if the prosecution would fulfill its Brady obligations? Yes, Your Honor. And according to Kiles v. Whitley, the prosecution's duty to disclose evidence applies even when the police fail to bring it to the prosecution's attention. Ms. Richards stood up, her professional demeanor slightly shaken. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, the prosecution would like to request a brief recess to review our position. Judge Matheson looked at his watch, then at Marcus, who remained calm and composed. The boy's performance had not only impressed him, but had also made him question his own initial assumptions about the case. Before I grant that recess, the judge said, I have one more question for you, Mr. Thompson. If you were in my position, how would you ensure that justice is served in this case? Marcus didn't hesitate. Your Honor, as Justice Brandeis wrote in his dissent in Olmstead v. United States, if the government becomes a lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. In this case, ensuring justice means not only examining the evidence thoroughly, but also acknowledging any biases or presumptions that may have led to my wrongful arrest. The courtroom fell silent again. Judge Matheson nodded slowly, impressed not just by the citation but by the wisdom behind the answer. The truth or lie game had revealed far more than he had anticipated, and it was becoming increasingly clear that this case would have an unexpected outcome. After the brief recess, the courtroom reconvened with a different energy. Judge Matheson had spent the break in his chambers, reviewing his notes and reflecting on the unexpected turn of events. When he returned to the bench, his expression was thoughtful. Before we continue, the judge announced, I'd like to address something directly. He turned his attention to Mr. Peterson, who was now looking considerably less confident than he had that morning. Mr. Peterson, would you please approach the bench? The store owner walked forward slowly, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. Marcus watched quietly, his mind already anticipating several possible legal scenarios. Mr. Peterson, Judge Matheson began, I understand you have security concerns at your store. However, I'm troubled by several aspects of this case. Detective Morris has shared some additional findings with me during our recess. Detective Morris stood up, holding a new folder. Your Honor, we've completed our analysis of the store's full security footage from that day. Mr. Thompson appears in only two brief instances, once in the morning when he walked past the store on his way to school, and once during the incident. There's no evidence of him casing the store as originally claimed. Mr. Peterson's face reddened. But I was certain. Were you? Judge Matheson interrupted. Or did you make assumptions based on something other than concrete evidence? Marcus raised his hand politely. Your Honor, if I may. After receiving a nod, he continued, according to Batson v. Kentucky, racial discrimination in any aspect of the justice system violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The courtroom grew silent. Marcus hadn't directly accused anyone of racial profiling, but his point was clear and legally sound. Ms. Richards, who had been reviewing new documents during the recess, stood up. Your Honor, in light of the new evidence and circumstances, the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Thompson. Judge Matheson nodded but held up his hand. Before I rule on that motion, I'd like to hear Mr. Thompson's thoughts on the larger implications of this case. Marcus stood, his posture straight but not rigid. Your Honor, this case illustrates several important legal principles. First, as established in Illinois v. Gates, probable cause must be based on the totality of circumstances, not mere suspicion. Second, according to Mapp v. Ohio, evidence obtained improperly should be excluded. But most importantly, he paused, looking directly at Mr. Peterson, as Justice Thurgood Marshall wrote, in recognizing the humanity of our fellow beings, we pay ourselves the highest tribute. This case could serve as an opportunity for education and understanding, rather than punishment. Judge Matheson leaned forward, impressed once again. And what would you suggest as a resolution? I would propose implementing a community education program at Tech Hub, focusing on implicit bias training and youth engagement. This aligns with the principles of restorative justice discussed in recent Supreme Court decisions regarding juvenile cases. The judge smiled, removing his glasses. Mr. Peterson, would you be willing to participate in such a program? The store owner, now looking thoroughly chastened, nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I may have acted hastily in this situation. Very well, Judge Matheson declared. I'm dismissing all charges against Marcus Thompson with prejudice. He turned to Marcus. Young man, your knowledge of the law is remarkable, but more impressive is your understanding of its purpose, to serve justice while maintaining human dignity. Sarah Thompson wiped tears from her eyes as Mr. Rodriguez patted her shoulder. In the gallery, several lawyers who had stopped in to watch the unusual proceedings were shaking their heads in amazement. Detective Morris approached Marcus after the formal dismissal. Kid, I've been on the force for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. You've got a real gift. Marcus smiled modestly. Thank you, Detective. As Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the law is not a series of calculating machines where answers come tumbling out when you insert the problem. It's about understanding human nature and justice. Judge Matheson watched this exchange from his bench, a decision forming in his mind. This young man's extraordinary understanding of the law, combined with his mature perspective on justice, had given him an idea, one that would soon open new doors for both Marcus and other young people in their community. The days following the dismissal of charges brought unexpected developments. Judge Matheson, intrigued by Marcus's exceptional abilities, had conducted his own investigation into the teenager's background. What he discovered left him even more impressed. In his chambers one morning, Judge Matheson spread out Marcus's academic records across his desk. Principal Warner from Roosevelt High School had sent over a detailed file at his request. Marcus hadn't just been taking advanced courses, he had already completed several college-level law classes through an online program at Northwestern University. This is remarkable, Judge Matheson muttered to himself, reviewing Marcus's perfect scores on constitutional law assignments. A knock on his chamber door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called out. Detective Morris entered, carrying a thick folder. Judge, you were right about the kid. We found something interesting about the actual theft case. The detective laid out several surveillance photos from other stores in the area. They showed the same tall figure with the neck tattoo involved in similar incidents across the city. The suspect has been identified as James Tank Wilson, known for using teenagers as diversions during his thefts. Meanwhile, at Roosevelt High School, Marcus was becoming something of a celebrity. Students who had barely noticed him before now stopped him in the hallways to talk about his courtroom performance. Videos taken by spectators had circulated widely on social media. During lunch period, Marcus sat with his best friend Kevin in the cafeteria, trying to maintain some normalcy. "Man, you're like a legal superhero now," Kevin said, biting into his sandwich. "Did you really cite Supreme Court cases from memory?" Marcus smiled modestly. "The law is like a puzzle. Once you understand how the pieces fit together, it's not that difficult." Their conversation was interrupted by the school principal, who approached their table. "Marcus, Judge Matheson is here to see you. He's waiting in my office." Curious, Marcus made his way to the principal's office. Inside, he found Judge Matheson chatting with his mother, who had apparently been called in as well. Sarah Thompson's face showed a mix of pride and nervous anticipation. "Marcus," Judge Matheson began, "please sit down. What I'm about to tell you is quite important." The judge explained how the real perpetrator had been identified and arrested, thanks partly to Marcus's observations about the security footage. But that wasn't why he had come. "I've been reviewing your academic records," Judge Matheson continued. "Your understanding of law at your age is unprecedented, which brings me to a proposal." He outlined his idea, a special youth legal advocacy program, with Marcus as its first participant. The program would allow gifted students to work with real lawyers on juvenile cases under strict supervision. "You wouldn't be practicing law, of course," the judge clarified, "but you would help other young people understand their rights and the legal system. Your experience could make a real difference." Sarah spoke up, her voice emotional. "Marcus has always wanted to help others. Ever since he was little, he's talked about fixing what's unfair in the world." Marcus listened carefully, his mind already racing with possibilities. Would this include working with Mr. Peterson's store on their bias training program? Judge Matheson nodded, impressed once again by Marcus's focus on constructive solutions. "Exactly. And there's more. The State Bar Association has expressed interest in documenting your case as a teaching tool for legal education reform." As they discussed the details, Detective Morris arrived with more news. "We just arrested Wilson. He confessed to using the confusion at TechHub to frame random bystanders. Marcus, your legal knowledge helped us crack a pattern we hadn't noticed before." The pieces were falling into place. What had started as a frightening case of mistaken identity had transformed into an opportunity to create real change. "There's one condition," Judge Matheson added, looking seriously at Marcus. "You have to maintain your grades and continue your regular studies. This program shouldn't interfere with your education." Marcus straightened in his chair. As Justice Brandeis said, knowledge is essential to understanding, and understanding should precede judging. "I promise to keep learning, Your Honor." The judge smiled, extending his hand to Marcus. "Then let's get started. We have a lot of work to do." As they left the principal's office, Sarah hugged her son tightly. Marcus had not only proven his innocence, but had opened a door to help others facing similar situations. His journey from accused to advocate was about to begin. 2 weeks after the courtroom incident, TechHub's storefront looked very different. The once imposing security guards had been replaced by friendly staff, and a new sign hung in the window: Community Youth Technology Program, all welcome. Inside, Marcus stood before a group of local business owners and teenagers, conducting the first session of the Bias Awareness Workshop. "The law protects everyone equally," Marcus explained, his voice confident and clear. "But understanding our unconscious biases is the first step toward true justice." Mr. Peterson sat in the front row, nodding attentively. The store owner had undergone a remarkable transformation since the incident. After the truth about Tank Wilson came to light, Peterson had become one of Marcus's strongest supporters, offering to turn his store into a hub for youth education programs. "I was wrong," Peterson admitted to the group. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I almost ruined a young man's life because of it. But Marcus taught me something valuable about justice and second chances." Meanwhile, across town at the courthouse, Judge Matheson was meeting with the State Bar Association. The conference room was packed with legal professionals eager to learn about the new youth advocacy program. "What happened with Marcus Thompson isn't just a single success story," the judge explained. "It's a wake-up call for our entire legal system. Young people, especially those from marginalized communities, need to understand their rights and have advocates who understand their perspectives. Sarah Thompson, who had been invited to speak at the meeting, shared her perspective as a parent. When Marcus was arrested, I was terrified. But watching him transform that experience into something positive, something that helps others, it's beyond anything I could have imagined. Back at Tech Hub, Marcus wrapped up the workshop with a cue and a session. One of the teenage participants raised their hand. But what if we can't memorize all those laws like you can? Marcus smiled. It's not about memorizing laws. It's about understanding basic rights and knowing when to seek help. That's why we're creating a peer support network. The network he mentioned was already taking shape. Judge Matheson had approved the formation of a Youth Legal Advisory Council, with Marcus as its first junior chairman. The council would work with local schools to educate students about their rights and provide resources for those facing legal challenges. Later that afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected visitor at Tech Hub. Detective Morris arrived with news about Tank Wilson's case. He's pleading guilty, Morris announced. Your observations about the security footage helped us connect him to 6 other cases. The DA's office wants to know if you'd be willing to speak at the sentencing hearing about the impact of his actions on innocent bystanders. Marcus considered this carefully. I'd like to speak, but not to demand a harsh sentence. I want to talk about rehabilitation and community restoration. As Justice Kennedy wrote, the law is a teaching tool as much as it is a source of punishment. The detective shook his head in amazement. You know, kid, you've changed how a lot of us think about juvenile justice. That evening, as Marcus and his mother walked home, they passed the courthouse where everything had started. The building looked different now, less intimidating, more like a place where justice was possible. Mom, Marcus said suddenly, I've been thinking about starting a scholarship fund with some of the settlement money Mr. Peterson offered. Sarah looked at her son proudly. After the incident, Peterson had offered a substantial settlement to avoid a civil lawsuit, but Marcus had different ideas about how to use it. We could help other kids study law, he continued, especially those who can't afford expensive programs. That's wonderful, honey, Sarah replied, squeezing his hand. You're already thinking like a true advocate for change. As they reached their apartment, Marcus noticed a package waiting at their door. Inside was a letter from the state Supreme Court, inviting him to speak at their annual Youth Justice Conference. The world's opening up for you, Sarah said, reading the invitation over his shoulder. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. It's opening up for all of us, Mom. Every person who learns their rights, every business owner who confronts their biases, every kid who realizes they can make a difference. We're all part of something bigger. The transformation from accused teenager to community leader was complete, but for Marcus Thompson, it was just the beginning of a longer journey toward justice and understanding. 1 year after the Tech Hub incident, the Cook County Courthouse buzzed with excitement. The main auditorium was packed for the inauguration of the Youth Legal Education and Advocacy Program, YLEAP, an initiative that had grown far beyond anyone's initial expectations. Marcus Thompson, now 16, stood at the podium, looking out at the diverse crowd. In the front row sat his mother Sarah, beaming with pride, alongside Judge Matheson, Mr. Peterson, and Detective Morris. Behind them were hundreds of students, legal professionals, and community members who had been touched by the program over the past year. When I stood in this courthouse a year ago, Marcus began, I was afraid, but that fear turned into something powerful, a chance to make real change. He paused, looking at the young faces in the audience. YLEAP has already helped 50 teenagers understand and navigate the legal system, but more importantly, it's helping build bridges between law enforcement, businesses, and our communities. The statistics supported his words. Since the program's pilot phase, juvenile arrests in their district had decreased by 30%. More cases were being resolved through mediation and community service rather than prosecution. Tech Hub's community program had become a model for other businesses, with 20 local stores now participating in similar youth engagement initiatives. Judge Matheson took the podium next. What started with one extraordinary young man's knowledge of the law has become a movement. Today, we're not just celebrating YLEAP's success, we're announcing its expansion to 5 more districts across Illinois. The scholarship fund Marcus had created with the settlement money had already helped 10 students begin their legal studies. Two of them were sitting in the audience, preparing to become the next generation of youth advocates. Mr. Peterson stood to share his perspective. This program taught me that true security doesn't come from suspicion and barriers. It comes from understanding and community engagement. Our store's profits have actually increased since we started working with young people instead of treating them as potential threats. After the ceremony, during the reception, Detective Morris pulled Marcus aside. "Remember Tank Wilson? He's been participating in our prison education program. Says your story inspired him to study law himself. He wants to help other ex-offenders reform when he gets out." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's what justice should be about, transformation, not just punishment." Sarah watched her son talking with judges, lawyers, and community leaders. She remembered the frightened boy in the holding cell and marveled at how far he'd come. The paralegal courses she'd been taking, inspired by her son's journey, were almost complete. Soon, they would both be working to make the legal system more accessible to everyone. As the reception wound down, a group of students approached Marcus. One of them, a shy 13-year-old girl, spoke up. "I want to do what you do. Where do I start?" Marcus smiled, remembering his own early fascination with law. "First, understand that every legal principle is built on something simple, the idea of fairness. Start there, and the rest will follow." Judge Matheson, overhearing this, smiled. He thought back to that day in his courtroom, playing truth or lie with a teenager who knew more about law than some attorneys. What had seemed like a simple case of shoplifting had transformed into a movement for change. Later that evening, as Marcus and his mother walked home, they passed Tech Hub. The store's windows now displayed student artwork alongside the latest electronics. A sign advertised free weekly technology classes for local youth. "You know, Mom," Marcus said, stopping to look at the store, "Justice Holmes once wrote that the law is not a set of rules but the very spirit of humanity in action." Sarah hugged her son, "And you're helping that spirit grow." As they continued home, Marcus thought about the future. The Youth Legal Advisory Council was planning to develop a mobile app to help young people understand their rights. Law schools were studying YLEAP as a model for community engagement. What had started with one wrongful arrest had bloomed into something that was changing lives across the city. The story of the judge who played truth or lie with a legal genius was now being told in law schools and community centers around the country. But for Marcus Thompson, it wasn't about being a genius. It was about using knowledge to build bridges and create change. As the sun set over Chicago, Marcus smiled, knowing that this was still just the beginning. The true test of justice wasn't in the courtroom victories, but in the lives transformed, one case, one person, one community at a time.